This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to tonight's edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I'm going to be talking with Jason Louv. He has written a book called John Dee and the Empire of Angels, Enochian Magic and the Occult Roots of the Modern World. It's a really long book, and it's a really well-written book. It's well worth picking up if this interests you at all. He has some really interesting stuff in here that no one else has quite put together. We'll be talking about that in the interview. I probably could have talked to him for 6 hours and not gotten through all the stuff I wanted to discuss from this book. But he didn't have that kind of time, so we did a normal length show, and I'm hoping you're going to enjoy it and it'll at least give you some foundation of what's in this book. It's out on Inner Traditions, who, put out all kinds of great stuff. And yeah, that's about it. There was a lot of stuff in here I didn't know. And the stuff we cover at the end about the effect on the modern world and stuff is a little bit scary as well as interesting. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Jason. So I'm talking with Jason Louv. And Jason, you have written a book called John Dee and the Empire of the Angels. And this is an epic book here. And you've actually cut this down a little bit from what got published?
Yeah, the book is 560 pages. It's out now from Inner Traditions. It's a hardback book. It's fully illustrated. Color plates, including the Enochian tablets and all kinds of other great goodies. The original manuscript was 250,000 words, but it's been cut down to distilled to the very best. So it's 560 pages, hardback. I believe it just came out in Europe as well, so it should be out worldwide.
Nice. Is it on ebook as well?
Yes, it's on a Kindle.
Okay. Is this your first book?
No, this is actually my 8th book.
Okay. I thought you had other stuff out there. You did the what's the name of the thing you have, the magic
Well, I've written several books about magic. My first book was called Generation Hex, and there was one called Ultra Culture Journal. These are anthologies of writing from magical practitioners from various generations. And I also did the Psychic Bible with Genesis Peerage, which is the complete record of the Temple of Psychic Youth, which is an occult and cultural activist group operating in the 1980s and 90s and onward into the future. So I've written quite a lot about the occult, but also worked as a mainstream journalist, written for Vice News, Boing Boing, covered international trade, surveillance, all kinds of great stuff.
I was thinking of magic.me is the thing I was thinking of, the website.
Right. Magic.me is a website where I teach courses on practical magic, everything from chaos magic to ceremonial magic to astral projection, I Ching, tarot, lucid dreaming, all kinds of great stuff. And that's much more hands-on. That's much beloved by my many students.
Now, how long did it take you to write this?
So John Dee and the Empire of Angels took me a total of 3 years to write, although I've been researching the subject for 15 years. But when you factor in the actual writing time, it was a pretty much full-time job. It was about 3 years.
Okay. Now you approached this differently than other people did. As I told you before, most of my familiarity with John Dee came from Crowley and a few other sources here and there. I didn't realize the impact he had across culture right down to today. But also, you talk about how biographers will separate out, like his mathematical work and his magical work, rather than taking it as a whole, as the culture back then would have done.
That's right. Well, maybe we should start with just saying who John Dee was. John Dee was Queen Elizabeth I's court astrologer and an early scientist, and widely regarded as the most intelligent man in Europe of his day. He was the first person to bring knowledge of higher mathematics to England. He is the person who coined the phrase British Empire and delivered the schematics to the English court on how to turn England from an impoverished island nation into the greatest empire the world has ever known. And he's really a fascinating character that stands right at the crossroads of alchemy and science. And as much as he was an early scientist, he really laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution to happen. But he was also immersed in the world of alchemy, magic, and the occult, and spent almost 10 years doing which was contacting angels or attempting to contact a higher order of reality. I often tell people who ask me about Dee, he's a little bit like Stephen Hawking. So if you imagine Stephen Hawking in our current lifetime, a man who's highly respected at the very top of his, regarded as the most brilliant scientist in perhaps the world, and with all the respect and accolades of his peers and of people in power. So if you imagine somebody like Stephen Hawking turning 50 and saying, you know what, I've had a pretty good run of it. I've learned everything I could from books and the people around me. I think that I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to smoking DMT and talking to aliens. Well, that's kind of what the deal with John Dee was. At the age of 50, he decided that he had learned everything that he could about the science of his day from the and published material that he could get his hands on. Of course, Dee had 5 times the books of Oxford and Cambridge at this time, England's largest library, and decided that if he wanted to learn anything more about the world, he would have to learn it from the angels themselves, which, of course, was widely believed in at the time. He was not unique in the belief that angels were real or that God was real and perhaps could even be by methods. So that's John Dee. Now, a lot of people books about John Dee, but I became convinced that I had to do a new one when I realized that the people who have written about Dee have really been split into 2 camps, and neither has grasped the big picture. So there's been a lot of writing about Dee from mainstream academics, mainstream historians, who have looked at Dee from the angle of, looked at Dee from the angle of, his scientific contributions, his imperial contributions, his importance to the Elizabethan court, but have either pushed to the side or completely ignored his interest in the occult, largely because they probably don't want to damage their own reputations. Academics have tenure to consider. They have their own, reputations as scholars to think about. So that part of Dee has been buried. And on the other hand, we have occult writers who have written about Dee, particularly those who have been interested in the Golden Dawn or Crowley or that side of things, the magical world. And they've written about Dee's occult discoveries, if you will, and his occult system, what's widely known as Enochian Magic. But by and large, that has been focused on exclusively and taken somewhat out of the context of the rest of Dee's life. So taken out of the context of what he was up to geopolitically, what he was up to scientifically, the religion and epistemology of the day. And I don't think that, on one hand, I don't think that you can understand Dee's magic without understanding the wider context of the world and his life and the Elizabethan court and what was going on in European geopolitics at that time. And from the scientific and imperial angle, I do have to say that I simply think it's disingenuous for even serious researchers to write about this man and then just discount an entire part of his life. Now, I certainly understand that we don't, by and large, believe in magic anymore. It's considered to be a relic of the Elizabethan or the Age or the Renaissance or pre-Enlightenment Europe, and not taken seriously. Now that's okay, and I'm completely on board with that. I'd certainly much prefer a world rooted in science and rationality than one rooted in magic and superstition. But that said, we simply can't look at somebody in historical context without at least trying to understand and take on board their worldview. Magic was a big part of Dee's life. It was a big part of everyone's life at the time, from the common people of England all the way up to the people in power, including Elizabeth and many members of the Elizabethan court. It was a part of how the world was constructed at the time. So I do have to say that to impose our own modern prejudices and biases and ways of seeing the world on history is simply doing bad history. It might not be doing bad science, but it is doing bad history. So what I've set out to do with this book is to piece those two things together. And for me, it's been a bit like splitting the atom in reverse. What's come out of that is a picture of the world and a holistic understanding of what was happening, not just in the Elizabethan era, but how that's impacted the 500 years of history that have come since. And it really was a shocking process to realize how this stuff came together and what the big picture was. And I think that outside of a few other scholars, specifically Nicholas Cluley and Deborah Harkness, whose work greatly influenced John Dee and the Empire of Angels, this is the first time that the full story has been told. It's the first time the full story has been told for a popular audience instead of an academic audience, and pieced together as one big whole, and then shown not just in the context of Dee's life, but in how that has resonated out and affected all of history.
Now, you said that he is the one who came up with the term the Great British Empire?
Well, the British Empire, that's right.
Yeah,
so yeah.
And what did that all come up from, and where did that go?
Well, Dee claimed that the phrase British Empire was given to him in a vision by the Archangel Michael, and no one had ever coined that phrase before. And the original context of that, by the way, was that Dee and Elizabeth were working on trying to figure out how to build a legal case for England to lay claim to the New World instead of Spain. So Spain had already laid claim to the New World because Columbus had gotten there first, at least among European people. Certainly there were lots of people already there. But Dee believed that, and he, from his readings in history, he believed that King Arthur had actually perhaps been to America first, North America. He thought that it was very likely that during Arthurian times, English sailors or voyagers had made it to North America and perhaps colonized parts of it. He also was interested in a man named Madoc, or King Madoc, another British king, English king, that Dee believed had perhaps made it to North America in the 10th century. And this was important for Dee because it established a mythic resonance, if you will, that England already had claim to North America, and this undercut Spain's legal hold on the New World. If Dee could prove that England had been 500 years before Spain, at least then that helped bolster their case that England should colonize North America, or had a right to colonies in North America. So the phrase British Empire, British, originally meant British in the context of Arthurian, Arthur's Britain, the mythical Britain, Albion. And so in terms of where that went, Dee was involved in what we might consider naval steps, where he was working with various private companies to finance voyages to find the Northwest Passage. So it was believed at this time that there had to be a way, like a water passage, perhaps a large river, or some way to get from the east coast of North America to the west coast. Dee believed this was probably the entrance was Scotia. And so first he worked with private companies. It's a bit like Elon Musk in a way. He worked with private companies to send ships to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia to look for the entrance to the Northwest Passage. They couldn't find it, and so what Dee next is he's the privateer Sir Francis Drake, who was, of course, a pirate, to circumnavigate the tip of South America, which had never been done before. And Drake succeeded in doing this. He sailed around the southern tip of South America and then up the west coast of South America, avoiding and sometimes bombing Spanish outposts along the way, because Spain had already been there but gotten there by the land route. And Drake finally landed at Drake's Bay, which is a few miles north of San Francisco. He dubbed it Nova Albion, or New England, a title which was later recycled for New England on the East Coast when the English decided they were just too lazy to go colonize San Francisco. But that mission was kept secret for 10 years. It was a black op, but England Dee was able to prove that it was possible to do that, which further helped the cause for British imperial settlement of North America. And then, of course, Dee proceeded from there he wrote a 5-volume set called The General and Rare Memorials, where he laid out the case for why there should be a British Empire, why England could conquer the world with naval capacity in the same way that the Roman Empire had conquered the world with roads, and that this was the key to imperial primacy going forward. And he also laid out the mathematical and astrological specifications for how to do this. He invented something called astronomical. He invented something called the paradoxical compass, which allowed people to chart by the stars better on voyages. And so he really laid out the whole toolkit on how to do this. And it's very likely that without that, the British Empire would not have happened, or would not have happened in the same form. Of course, the credit for this is not given to Dee in history, because, again, Dee has been kind of whitewashed out of history. The credit usually goes to people like Sir Walter Raleigh and various others who were instrumental in enacting Dee's plans, but it was Dee who laid out the blueprint in the first place. So when we consider that prior to World War I, the British Empire was known as the empire on which the sun never sets, so named because the sun was always up somewhere in its territories around the world, and that it controlled over 1/4 of the entire planet. That's pretty profound. And then when we consider also that even when the British Empire fell, the control of the world was largely passed to America, and the American, which really is an outgrowth of the British Empire, English, and the Anglo-American establishment, as many have called it, has essentially ruled the world since Dee's work. This has been the ruling order of the Elizabethan Age. So historically speaking, that's a pretty important thing to look at. And in terms of us asking, why are we here? What is the modern world? Even to begin to think, okay, so all of this came out of the occult rituals of an alchemist trying to talk to angels. Well, what does that mean about history, right? What does that mean about who we are and where we are? That's a fascinating thread to start pulling on. And as I found out, and ended up, of course, working for years on this, as I found out, once you start pulling that thread, the whole thing starts to unravel, the whole tapestry of history.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating. I never would have made that connection whatsoever. I guess no one else has either, really, have they?
Well, they have an academic writing. Francis, there's some great scholars that have commented on this. Certainly Dame Frances Yates and Deborah Harkness and various others, all of whom I thank in the book. But I feel like nobody has really, how do I put it? Nobody has really, basically what I did in this book is I pulled my truck up right next to that part of history and started honking my horn really, really loud, saying, look at this. pay attention to this. This is really, really important because even though people have written about it, um, y- it's been in academic texts as so many things are.
Um, you also incorporate in the magic stuff
That's right.
and the
That's right.
effect that has had on our culture. One of the things I want to get to first, though, is that Dee, for the most part, was poor most of his life. Despite being such a brilliant guy, despite all this stuff, he never really made money at it.
That's right. But it's really important this is a really important point because things like this, people will often use as a way to say, oh, well, magic is, there's something bad about magic. Magic will ruin you. You'll die poor. It's bad, all this stuff. And they say the same thing about Crowley and people like that. But the important thing to realize is that, okay, yes, Dee was shockingly poor throughout his life. But look, everybody was.
Right.
Elizabethan England. I mean, England at this time was essentially a third world country. It was shockingly poor. There had been famines. Famines had also been rolling through Europe. And this is one of the primary reasons why the age of exploration happened. One of the reasons they were so hot to trot to colonize the New World is because they were so shockingly poor. There weren't resources, and Europe really became rich. England became rich, as so many post-colonial writers will point out, through plunder, right? Through plundering the resources of North America, and South America, and Africa, and India, and Asia. I mean, Europe became rich by raping the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Dee, yeah, Dee was almost transient throughout most of his life. He was book rich. He had inherited a house from his mother and spent most of his life going into debt to buy books, spending on the order of over a £1,000 by modern terms in buying and collecting books. So that's where most of his money was going. But he was he was on a stipend from the Elizabethan court. But the important thing to realize is, Dee probably rose as far as he could have given the economics of the time, given his class background. We have to remember that England is not a very flexible society. You pretty much stay in where you're born, in your class.
Right.
And it certainly was at the time. But, by way of comparison, so Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Dee's contemporary and is the person who founded the British intelligence services, what we now know as MI5 and MI6, even Walsingham died broke. Walsingham was financing the creation of the British intelligence services out of his own pocket and died greatly in debt because he wasn't getting any money from Elizabeth to do it, simply because the Elizabethan court was so broke. So that's important to remember and to put in context. But yeah, it was the 15th century. Nobody had it easy. Life was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did the whole thing with the Enochian Magic start?
So Dee had been fascinated with the occult for his entire life. It was and the important thing to realize there is that, as you touched on earlier, there was no distinction, no separation between the occult and the other fields of study. For the intellectual elite of this time, the intelligentsia, they saw it all as one big thing: mathematics, physics, optics, astronomy, astrology, the occult, Hermeticism, Kabbalah. It was all the same thing for them because they were still working on the fundamental assumption that there was one true core knowledge of what the world was, and they were just picking at different angles of it, and that knowledge had been laid down by God and the angels. So for the scientists of this day, what they were really trying to do is understand the mind of God and understand the world, because the idea that, the material science idea that there was a distinction between the worlds of matter and of, subjective thinking in the mind, that separation had not yet been made. So Dee had been a very keen intellectual student of magic, and particularly astrology and Kabbalah. and he had extensive occult theories on optics. That had been going on for his whole life. It was just part of his intellectual learning. But it wasn't until the 1560s that he began to make actual attempts on his own to actually do magic. And the magic that Dee was trying to do was contact angels through the medium of a scrying crystal, which is just a piece of crystal that's used as a focus to go into a trance state to facilitate, a hypnotic type state through which one can communicate with, in theory, non-human intelligences. He couldn't do it. He was too rational. He was too much of a hard head, as they say. And so what happened was that Dee had to audition kind of a rotating cast of scryers. And scryers are people who that's their full-time job, or was. This was a common profession at the time, was to go into these states to make psychic pronouncements or try to divine things or figure out what was, get information for people, cast astrological charts, that type of thing. So he tried several with varying degrees of success, but in the early 1580s, he met an individual named Edward Kelly. Kelly was half his age, about 25 at the time. Dee was 50. Overweight. He'd had his ears cut off for forging coins. He was an alcoholic, very likely mentally ill. He came with a frightening reputation of having dug up, was accused of digging up corpses, resurrecting them through necromancy, accused of summoning demons, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But he had the gift, he had the knack, he could do it. And he could go into these trance states, and the information he was delivering to Dee from the other side, as it were, was suitably impressive to Dee that he decided it was the real deal. It matched up with books in his library and things like that, things he'd already read. Of course, this opens the easy interpretation of that Kelly could have simply been reading the books in Dee's library and feeding back information that he thought would impress him so that he could get money for doing what he was doing. But one way or the other, the two men formed a working partnership that would last 7 years, and they were doing occult rituals 2 to 3 times a day in many cases to contact angels of reality. And that's where what's now known as Enochian Magic comes out of. Enochian Magic is the system that the angels delivered for making further contact, establishing deeper contact between those realms, the human world and the angelic world. That's now broadly written about as Enochian Magic, although it was never called Enochian at the time and has nothing to do with the Book of Enoch, by the way. They simply called this the angelic conversations or the angelic sessions at the time. But
so
that's how that all started.
How did it get the name Enochian?
So that name came from later writers, occult writers in the 17th and 18th century, talking about Dee's magic, talking about it had been discovered by Elias Ashmole, and parts of Dee's diaries had been circulating, and so people have been writing about them. And at some point, it got the label Enochian Magic. The only reason that it was called Enochian is because Enochian is just a general descriptive term for really old, antediluvian, as it were, pre-flood, and contemporaneous with the city of Enoch. And so the idea there being that it was magic related to the very beginning of the world. But this has confused a lot of people, particularly for the reason that they assume that all of this must have something to do with the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which it only does very tangentially, but not directly.
Okay. And, I mean, the system they came up with for Enochian Magic is very complex.
Yes, it's exceedingly complex.
Do you want to give people just a brief overview of what they brought out of this communication?
Sure. So Enochian is a system for, well, as I said, making deeper contact with angels. A big part of it is the language, or the angelic language, which is now sometimes called Enochian. This is the language that the angels said was spoken by angels and by humanity before the fall from the Garden of Eden, so the original language of mankind. This is something that had been a real holy grail for decades at least, and potentially centuries. It was one of the big overwhelming goals of the Renaissance occult world, for people to discover this language, but it wasn't truly discovered until Dee. But the angels delivered this system, and moreover, they intimated to Dee and Kelly that it was to be used to hasten the apocalyptic timeline, to bring the world closer to the end of the world, and then, of course, to the second coming of Christ. But that, of course, in order to get to the second coming of Christ, we would have to go through the apocalyptic events as depicted in the book of Revelation. The angels were quite serious about this. They wanted Dee and Kelly to assist them in bringing it about. They actually suggested that there should be a kind of new world order, if you will. They wanted the entire world. They wanted the British Empire to control the entire world under Elizabeth. They wanted the entire world also to be controlled by a new religion, a new Hermetic super religion that they would deliver, that would heal the rift between Catholicism and Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, paganism, all of it, and that would be administered by the angels themselves. So they did want one totalizing world empire and spiritual empire. And that's a shocking bit of history. That's one of the things that hasn't really been fully explicated or shown to the public by those two camps of writing on Dee. As I've mentioned, something that's really brought out by the scholar Deborah Harkness in her work. Deborah Harkness, of course, went on to become a best-selling fiction author, but she did her doctoral work on Dee, and that was one of the things that she really shows quite clearly emerging from Dee's spirit diaries, and that's a pretty shocking thing to think about.
Yeah, and that's now they predicted the apocalypse to Dee and Kelly, didn't they?
Well, it wasn't as much predicted as they said it was already happening.
Okay. And what was their response to that? I mean, obviously it didn't happen.
Are you sure about that?
Good point. What made this kind of spirit contact different from other things, like Go Asia and stuff like that? Like, what was the distinct differences?
Well, there's a very distinct difference between what they were doing and Go Asia. So Go Asia is, a Greek word. It's a general term for consort with evil spirits, summoning lower spirits or evil spirits. And this is an important point to make. Of course, Go Asia is, in our modern world, something that modern-day students of the occult invariably get all tangled up with and snagged on. But and of course, there's been some, back and forth. People like to say, are the spirits of the Go Asia actually demons, or are they ancient spirits, or, are they spirits that were demonized by Christianity? Well, when the angels showed up in the angelic session, they made a very clear point at the edge of a flaming sword that the spirits of the Go Asia are absolutely demonic, are completely inimical to humankind, are not to be trusted, are lower, are demonic, are bad for people, and a lot of the sessions were spent with the angels exorcising the demons, particularly from Kelly, who had been doing a lot of goetic magic. Their distaste for Go Asia was profound and vitriolic, and they make no bones about it that Kelly, those who traffic with Go Asia or Kelly in this instance without repentance are damned to the pit of brimstone and eternal torment. And so the angels make a very, very clear distinction between themselves and the Go Asia, or the demonic realms in general. And they spend about the first 2 years of the sessions just trying to exorcise that stuff off of Kelly. And it's only until they can get Kelly a bit more spiritually sorted out that the lines of communication really open up in the Enochian session. So Enochian is different in the sense that it is purely angelic. It is purely concerned with the contact of the angels, as more or less as described on the label, more or less as described in the Old Testament. And that's not a very nice or easy process. The angels, particularly as they become more and more frustrated with Dee and Kelly, the angels are quite wrathful and punishing in many instances. Much as they are in the Old Testament when humanity begins to frustrate them. Although it's not like they go into the sessions with complete good faith, but it's only the skullduggery of particularly Kelly that begins to bring out their wrath. Or Kelly continues, for instance, to traffic with the Go Asia in secret behind closed doors, in addition to the Enochian sessions, and this will just simply won't stand for them. So at the same time, it's much more direct and pure than any grimoire system of magic. In fact, the angels, when they manifest, one of the first things that Dee does is bring them all of the various grimoires that have been floating around Europe. What we now know as perhaps the grimoire tradition, where he brings them things like the Book of Soiga and the Key of Solomon and various other things. And they kind of look down their noses at it. They essentially say, oh, well, that's nice. It's kind of like when you look at a kid showing you a drawing of something and you say, oh, yes, that really looks like an elephant. Because you don't want to hurt their feelings, but it clearly does not look like an elephant. And so the kind of the view of the angels, the actual line is, when they deliver Enochian, they say, oh yes, the grimoires, all that, so-called magicians, they have all played at this knowledge. They've been LARPing, essentially, what the true magic is, because the true magic is the innate mode of action of angels. Right? It doesn't have that much to do with the mortal world. And so the angels say, like all this magic crap, like all this stuff that's been floating around Europe, all the stuff that's been collected in books like Agrippa and Trithemius and things like that. It's like, it's a nice try. It's a nice try. But the thing from the source instead of reconstructed or a best guess created by human practitioners. And that, for me, is why Enochian is, I would say, certainly the most interesting artifact in the Western occult tradition. But really, if you were to really press me on it, I would have to say it's perhaps the most valid and perhaps only valid artifact in the Western occult tradition, or the central thing that should be studied, because it's a delivered system instead of something that's just cobbled together out of books.
Now, did they have physical manifestations of these things as well as the scrying sessions?
On a regular basis. Yeah, I mean, most of the sessions they were seeing in the crystal or in trance states through Kelly, but they regularly saw spirits in the house. They saw spirits out in the fields around the house, or when they were in Europe. They saw spirits in the clouds when they were traveling from England to the continent by ship. They quite regularly got manifestations. It was similar to accounts of alien abductions or something like that.
What do you make of what they did? Do you think that they you have, if I'm not mistaken, you've done some work with Enochian Magic, right?
Well, I wouldn't be a good scholar or journalist if I didn't look firsthand, would I?
So what do you make of the system?
In what sense?
Like, was there something to it? Was it just them being delusional? Was Kelly faking it? Like, what would be your best guess on what was going on? You present a few of them in the book.
Yeah, I present several options in the book where I look at it from many different angles. For instance, we have to consider these in terms of it's possible Kelly was mentally ill, it's possible Kelly was making it up, it's possible they were both on drugs, it's possible that there was some type of cryptography involved, that this was masked cryptography and not actually about the occult at all. It's possible that this was being used as some way to give bad information to the English court by other, Catholic intelligence agents, using Kelly as a pawn and convincing Dee this information was real. That certainly happened before in history. Even in the 20th century, Ian Fleming was going to employ Crowley to give bad occult messages and bad horoscopes to Rudolf Hess to throw off the German war effort, although that plan never came to fruition. Although Fleming did name his character James Bond, give him the moniker 007, which comes straight from Dee himself, and of course based his nemesis Blofeld on the head of Spectre on Crowley. But what actually happened? Well, it could have been a combination of all of those things. In terms of the Enochian system, in my experience, the Enochian system is the most profoundly beautiful and effective form of magic, and is immensely potent at causing altered states of consciousness, inducing visionary states, and profound alterations in one's consciousness and sense of self that other occult systems just can't match. But that said, what we're talking about is purely subjective. What we're talking about when we talk about magic, for the most part, is things that are happening in people's heads, right? One criticism of magic is, oh, well, that's all in your head. You had all these great experiences. That's all in your head. My response to that is, well, what isn't?
Yeah.
The whole world is subjective in a way, or at least our experience of it and our response to it. Sure, magic's in your head. Well, how you feel about your partner's in your head. How you feel about yourself is in your head. Your plans for your career are in your head. What you think the universe is in your head. The extent of your learning and intelligence is in your head. What's not in your head? At no time do we actually contact anything that we could call objectively true. We have only our subjective internal experience to go on. But we can make leaps and best guesses about what's objectively true through things like the scientific method and mathematics, two things, by the way, that Dee was instrumental in popularizing. Science and math were not popular at Dee's time, and he was very, very instrumental in making them, bringing them to the public. Now, okay, so that's a tangent. So that to the side. Is Enochian real? Enochian is probably the most potent form of magic subjectively that I've come across in terms of dramatically altering consciousness and bringing wisdom and understanding, let's say, into the life of somebody doing it. Much like meditation would. Certainly, I don't think anyone would argue, for instance, that meditating for 10 years or 20 years is not real. Right? Somebody,
Right.
You're like a Buddhist monk. Okay, so a Buddhist monk meditates for 10 years, 20 years, and gains great wisdom and insight and understanding and clarity and peace and a transformed outlook on the world. I don't think there's anybody on the planet who would say that's not real in some sense. I mean, all the way down, not just subjectively, but all the way down to the level of, they've done MRI scans and CAT scans of long-term meditators and shown that their brains are actually different. So Enochian Enochian ritual is quite similar. It's just that it's condensed, so that instead of taking 10 years or 20 years, it takes maybe a year or two. And that now that said, when you condense it that much, it does become apocalyptic. Your life will fall apart because you can't go through that profound of a level of shift in consciousness, shift of outlook in the world without some rockiness in the world, because everything in your life right now is predicated on your current state of consciousness. Everything in your life right now is the result of decisions you've made in the past, decisions you're currently making in your life about what you value, what you don't value, what to do, where to invest your time and attention. All of those decisions are predicated on your consciousness, your level of understanding of what the universe is, your level of understanding of what you are and what your life is. When you radically shift that, the substrate of all of that, the wisdom and understanding, what you think the universe is, what you are, when your level of insight and enlightenment, if you will, when you radically change the substrate of all of that, then all those decisions get remade. The whole world falls apart because the whole world is predicated on decisions that came from a prior state of consciousness. So when your consciousness changes, then all of the external things in your life have to change to match it. And when you do it that quickly, like for instance with Enochian, it will be quite apocalyptic. Hence the reputation that Enochian has for being apocalyptic and causing disasters and things like this. It's like, yeah, well, man up. Or woman up,
Right.
or any, or gender up, any gender combination you would like. It's all there. But just chin up, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Why did they stop?
They stopped because the main reason there's a lot of reasons why. The main reason they stopped is because Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, kind of lured. Well, first, what he did is he baited and kind of cajoled and a little bit threatened Dee and Kelly into working on alchemy for him. Now, alchemy was the real holy grail of Europe at this time. Everyone in Europe was engaged in an arms race for the secrets of alchemy. They all thought it was possible, and there's no reason why they shouldn't have, by the way. It makes at least intuitive sense. Let's say it this way. It's an easily proposed hypothesis that metals could be changed into each other, right? So if we have all these metals, gold, silver, lead, aluminum, on and on and on, the idea was that they might be reconfigurations of the same substance, right? Now that's something that you can easily see people thinking as an untested hypothesis. It makes common sense. It makes intuitive sense. It's not true, but you can easily see how people would think that. So it was widely believed that it would be possible, and that, of course, the one that people really wanted was base lead into gold, because that would have provided a source of, huge amount of money, and not just money, but an economic advantage at the time that all of the European powers were kind of locked in a Cold War with each other. The 30 Years' War was not long in the future. It was the inevitable outcome of the Protestant Reformation that there was going to be a war between the Protestant and Catholic powers. So there was a real Cold War and arms race on, particularly in the economic sphere. And so they all wanted to figure out alchemy. Now, Dee saw alchemy as the process of a human gaining spiritual wisdom, which nobody was particularly interested in. Although that said, he really did provide the true secret of riches to Elizabeth, which was simply to colonize the New World. So he solved the problem of economic scarcity. He just did it in a completely different way. Now, so Rudolph II wanted them to work on alchemy. I mean, this was really the only interest that all these monarchs had in the occult. And they ended up in a situation where Dee and Kelly were working on alchemy full time. Kelly was, because Kelly was a shifty guy, he was using this as an excuse to learn everything that he could about alchemy from Dee, which he actually had been doing even from their first meeting. One of the things that Kelly was doing in the background was all of this was trying to absorb everything that he could about alchemy from Dee's library and from Dee himself. Now, Dee was a brilliant man. He was a great scholar, but he was also naive, and quite naive about the what people around him were up to and their intentions. And one of Kelly's intention was that he wanted to learn enough alchemy that Dee was no longer necessary. And part of also in their final sessions, they were talking to the angels and asking the angels for the secrets of alchemy, a lot of which were delivered. Although, of course, from the angels' perspective, again, it had to do with the spiritual growth of human beings and things like this, and healing and spiritual healing and stuff like that. So, but Kelly essentially learned everything that he could, and then he threw Dee under the bus. He said to Rudolph, "We don't need this guy anymore. Pay me everything, and I'll do it. Don't worry." And that's what happened. Dee was no longer needed. And the shocking thing also was that news of this got back to England, and England also, that Elizabeth came to the same conclusion that Dee was no longer necessary. It was Kelly they wanted because they figured out that he actually knew enough alchemical information that he was much more valuable than Dee, which is a real tragic turn of events, particularly because since Dee had been so loyal to the English crown, even he had undergone torture and poverty and deprivation because of his patriotic loyalty to the English crown. Dee had had many chances throughout his life to sell his services to higher bidders, but he believed in England to the very end, but he wasn't rewarded for that at all in his lifetime. England, Elizabeth was even sending secret agents and things like that to Europe to try and retrieve Kelly, because at this point he was essentially a national security asset. The fact that England came to the conclusion that even if Kelly was still lying and still a fraud, they needed him. They figured he knew something, and they were doing their best to return him to England simply for the fact that they didn't want other powers having access to his knowledge. He just knew too much, right? So, but what happened was, here's the thing. As soon as Kelly threw Dee under the bus, Rudolph said, "Oh, you know all the secrets. Okay, well, great. Well, tell you what, I'm going to lock you up in prison in a tower, and you're going to do it for me for free." How's that for you? And so Kelly was imprisoned, particularly after Rudolph figured out that there were English agents lurking around. He locked Kelly up so they couldn't get to him. He was locked up in a tower and forced to do alchemy, during which time he wrote some pretty interesting alchemical texts that still survive, including one that makes reference to chaos as the ultimate element of the universe, which sounds like a chaos magic text.
Yeah.
Fascinatingly enough. But no one knows exactly how he died, but the most commonly believed story is that he attempted to jump out the window of the tower where he was imprisoned and broke his legs and hobbled away, but died shortly thereafter. So he quite likely got his just desserts, although we don't know the true story. Anything could have happened. Whereas Dee returned to England, regained a small stipend from the crown. He was later put out to pasture in Manchester, where he was given the wardenship of a college in Manchester, and was kind of just teaching students for the next 10 years or so. Really fascinating thing about that is that he continued to do the angelic scrying sessions with a new scryer, and he did another 10 years of scrying. Of course, the scrying that he did with Kelly is the sessions that we know, and the most famous, and the stuff that all the stuff that Enochian comes out of. But fascinatingly enough, he continued to do scrying sessions throughout the 1590s with a new scryer, but he burned all of the records sometime in the late 1590s. I think that he was, I believe he writes in his diaries that some, prophecies they gave or proclamations angels gave turned out not to be true. So he assumed that they were lying spirits, or the scryer that he was working with was not reliable, something like that. So he burned all of that material, which may have comprised more material than he got through Kelly. It's a great lost mystery and lost bit of history. I would love to know what was in those sessions.
Yeah, no kidding. So how does this filter down then centuries later to like the Golden Dawn and then Crowley and such?
Yeah, so Dee's manuscripts circulated throughout Europe. They were of fascination to Elias Ashmole, who was an antiquarian in England and one of the very first modern Freemasons, and was central to the creation of the Freemasons as we now know them. They circulated throughout the Rosicrucian underground in continental Europe. There was, of course, a lot of interchange between the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, and they were probably essentially the same group deep down. But they were passed around kind of from hand to hand, particularly in the upper echelons of the English nobility for the next few hundred years. By the 19th century, they had come to the attention of scryers and angelic magicians named Frederick Hockley and I think Kenneth Mackenzie, and the people who were kind of the people, the magicians whose work went into or was helpful in teaching the people who created the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn really pieced together an amazing synthesis of all the occult material that had come before. Gregor Mathers, was the principal intellect behind the Golden Dawn, one of the founding members, who was an esoteric Freemason who was much more interested in explicitly magical pursuits. Mathers spent a tremendous amount of time in the British Library attempting to piece together all of the occult knowledge that was available to him at that time in the library. Again, working under the assumption that it was all coming from one source, that there was some primal tradition that all these things were scraps of. We now know with more academic rigor that that's probably not true, but McGregor Mathers acted as if it was true and created the Golden Dawn system using this assumption, which pieced together Egyptology, Kabbalah, tarot, geomancy, and lots more. The grimoires, or at least what was known of the grimoires and known of Egyptology at that time, their knowledge, and then used the Enochian tablets, the watchtowers, as the underpinning for the entire thing. So the watchtowers are actually only one part of the Enochian system. They're probably about 10% of the whole thing, and they're only the part of the Enochian system that's concerned with working with the elements. And so just one tiny part of it, but he got the watchtowers. That's all he had access to, because he only had access to the part of to A True and Faithful Relation, as published by America Saubon, which publishes only the part of D.N. Kelly's records relating to the watchtowers and then the Enochian calls. And so he took the watchtowers and the Enochian calls out, put them in the Golden Dawn system, decided that they were incomplete because they were have access to the rest of Dee's diaries. But instead of looking for the rest of the diaries, he pieced together, he filled in the gaps by adding in or overlaying Kabbalah and Egyptology and all this other stuff. And what came out of that was Golden Dawn and Enochian, which is beautiful and fascinating and inspiring synthesis of various cultural traditions and magical systems, but really is not historically accurate. It's not accurate in the sense that it does not faithfully reproduce what was in D.N. Kelly's original sessions. And I think certainly, Egyptians and tarot and things like that, they didn't have any knowledge of Enochian as far as we know. Although, this is from the same time that people would say things like, Blavatsky was around, and they would say things like, oh, these have all been inherited from previous root races or the ancient Atlanteans or things like this, and these kind of silly ideas of romantic ideas about prior cultures. But that was Golden Dawn Enochian. It was only given to the highest echelons of the Golden Dawn, the inner adepts, and the second and third order of the Golden Dawn, or specifically the second order. And it was Crowley. Of course, Crowley was a Golden Dawn member. Crowley probably took Enochian more seriously than any of the Golden Dawn members. It had previously been experimented with by Florence Farr and by Crowley's mentor, Alan Bennett, who later became a Buddhist monk. But Crowley really went for it, and he was the first one, at least, to record in the modern age, working through the 30 Enochian Aethers, and work with the watchtowers as well. And Enochian really became a big part of Crowley's personal magical universe. And it's probably, I would have to say that Crowley's experimentation with Enochian is what brought him, well, I will say this, it's what brought him past where the Golden Dawn had gone, because the Golden Dawn only goes so far. They made a lot of headway, but they only go so far. And Crowley got to the end of where they had gotten to and said, okay, well, what now? And then, and of course, by that time, the order had fallen apart. And at that point, it's at that point that he began, serious experimentation with Enochian, and that's what seemed to have carried him even further.
Okay. And how true was Crowley's version to Dee's version?
Well, do you mean how historically accurate were his methods?
Yeah.
So the methods were not overlapping at all with Dee and Kelly's. Crowley approached the Aethers as a vision quest, if you will, whereas Dee and Kelly believed that the Aethers referred to parts of the world and parts of the sky. That's what the angel said, and it was so Crowley used them quite differently. That said, the writing, I do have to say that the writing that comes out of Crowley's Enochian sessions is perhaps the most profound and most interesting of Crowley's entire career. Crowley wrote a lot of, tedious stuff and insightful stuff and brilliant stuff. But it's with the Enochian stuff, I think perhaps more even than his other quote unquote channeled writings, you get material that is, undoubtedly profound and insightful into the nature of reality. Once you understand the full context of what he's talking about. So his results, that said, his results were very unique to him. The visions he got were very dependent on Crowley's internal cosmology and not Dee and Kelly's, for instance. But one thing that I've done in the book is I've tried to link them up and show how it's part of one continuum. And that also has been quite shocking, the implications of when you put together Crowley and Neuberg's work. Victor Neuberg is his assistant in those workings, with Dee and Kelly's, and see them as part of a continuum.
Yeah. Okay.
And no one, by the way, just as an aside, no one had done that either. So putting together those two things was another big reason why I wrote this book. That was, again, putting together the whole picture. Nobody had reconciled Dee and Kelly's visions with Crowley's, and I think that was important to do.
Okay. Do they seem like they're coming from the same place?
Yes and no. Yes, I think so. But we have to remember that magic is very subjective. It's very, it's not a science. We're dealing with subjective reality. It's like dreams, right? No two people are going to have the same dreams, right? Even if they follow the same methods to get lucid dreams, for instance, let's say, as an analogy, two people can follow the exact same methods to get lucid dreams. They may work exactly the same for them. They will both have lucid dreams, and the methods can be refined scientifically. I mean, I can tell people easily how to have lucid dreams and things like that, and it'll work if they follow the instructions. That said, the actual content of their dreams is going to be different and is going to be dependent on them, their life, their unconscious psychological makeup, all of that. And I don't think I don't think that's controversial at all. That's just how it is. And it's kind of the same with magic. You follow the rituals, you do the processes, you get the results. The results can be, two people doing the same things, the same ritual or the same yogic process are probably going to have very similar results. But the actual content of the visions are going to be different because they're two different people.
Okay. With what little time we have left here, talk a little bit about the evangelical movement and how this ties into Dee and how it's affecting our current world.
Right. So the evangelicals in America, particularly since the beginning of the 20th century, have been completely taken with the idea of apocalyptic literalism. The idea that the apocalypse is literal, the events described in the book of Revelation are literal. This is a much more modern take on Revelation. The Catholic Church never believed this. Only the Protestants did, and particularly the evangelical Protestants took this utterly literal view of the apocalypse. And since the beginning of the 20th century, particularly with the circulation of something called the Schofield Reference Bible in America, and with the popularity of mega preachers like first Billy Sunday and then Billy Graham, and people to come after them, the ones like them in today's world, there's been a tremendous push towards apocalyptic literalism and the idea that not only is the world coming to an end, and not only is the second coming at hand, but that God relies on the action of humans to make it happen, to move along the timeline, that it's not just going to happen if people don't force it, as a vanguard movement. And the now that sounds silly to any educated adult. I hope that sounds silly to any educated adult, but it didn't sound silly to, for instance, people like Ronald Reagan, who believed that the end of the world was at hand, and that it was his sacred task to shepherd America through an apocalyptic confrontation with the forces of Satan as manifested by Russia, the evil empire, all this. And it was taken very seriously by George W. Bush, who believed it was his sacred mission to, destroy Iraq, and that he saw the forces of apocalypse at work in Iraq. It's certainly taken very, very seriously, perhaps most seriously of all, by Mike Pence and many members of the current Republican administration. We can see it in the bombing of Damascus recently, which is a fulfillment of prophecy from the book of Isaiah. We can see it in the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, American embassy to Jerusalem. These are all chess moves in the big apocalyptic game that the American right has been playing for at least 100 years. Now, this goes back not just from the American right, but it goes back to the British evangelicals, and the British evangelicals go straight back to the Protestant Reformation. We can see the genesis of many of these ideas in Dee and Kelly and their contemporaries, and it was the angels themselves in the Spirit Diaries that lay out the same theology. Say the end of the world is at hand. Human agents must urge it along with their own activity, and that Dee and Kelly were on the hook. They were directly implicated and told to do everything they could to help the angels hasten the apocalyptic timeline. And this is an idea, by the way, that is not a fringe belief. 1 in 3 Americans, according to a Pew Forum on Religion in 2006, that it is the end of the world and that the second coming will occur in their lifetime, literally, not as a metaphor, not as some type of way of talking about the battle of good and evil in every human being's heart, or as a teaching story for morality or anything like this, but literally that heaven will open up, Jesus will come down, people will disappear like in the Left Behind movies and books, be raptured up into heaven. Demons will appear, the Antichrist and the one world government will arise and persecute the true believers, and all of this silly Star Wars stuff, right? But they truly believe it. And not only do they truly believe it, but they're willing to enforce that story at the point of nuclear warheads on everyone else in the planet, the other 2/3 of the planet that does not take this literally, right? And of course, this apocalyptic literalism and extremism is not just Christian, but obviously extends to Islam. It extends to Judaism in some senses. It's a bad story that has held the world captive, and it's at the causal root of a lot of the violence and suffering in our world right now. Not just the turmoil and conflict in the Middle East, or battlegrounds like women's reproductive rights in the U.S., which hinge on these things, but also the attitude of the evangelical right towards the environment, the idea, and this is really at the heart of their rejection of the science around global warming, where they believe that the environment doesn't matter, the state of the environment doesn't matter. because Jesus is coming back, and that's what's really going on. Not that we have to take care of the world as it is, because they see the world as an illusion. They see it as something that is going to be destroyed anyways in the final reckoning, the final battle between Christ and the forces of darkness. And when you think about this long enough, what you realize is that, look, what is the book of Revelation? It's probably something that some guy wrote down when he was tripping like 1900 years ago. John of
Yeah.
Patmos. It's like the dude was probably high, wrote down his trip, and here we are almost 2,000 years later, or really about 2,000 years later, threatening total nuclear Armageddon because we think it's real.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's pretty frightening to think about,
yeah.
because that's not a mindset you can reason with.
No, it's not. But it is one that you can understand. And one of the reasons that I've written this book is because I want people to understand this. One of the real flaws in, I think, the mass media right now, or let's not say the mass media, but certainly the academic discourse, the media discourse, how the educated media elite sees the world. I worked as a journalist for most of my life. I lived in Los Angeles and New York and London, and so I have a sense of, a very good sense of how the media elite, if you were, sees the world. And I don't mean that conspiratorially, by the way. When I say media elite, I just mean, people who have been to have grad school degrees and, are secular humanists and are educated and, see the world. The type of people who are educated and trained for media jobs, they don't consider questions of faith or religion seriously at all. They assume that it's superstition. And I'm sorry, but that's, again, it's like when people study Dee, I'm sorry, but that is a massive misunderstanding of the world. And it's arrogant, in my opinion. Even if you yourself are completely atheistic, secular, one's own beliefs don't really matter in this sense. It is an insult to the world to not at least try to understand their beliefs. And I think that if we are going to live together on this planet as a human species, we need to pay each other at least give each other the honor and respect of trying to understand each other's beliefs, so that we can have a conversation where we understand each other. And we saw in the 2016 election the breakdown between those two worldviews, the evangelical right and the largely secular, progressive, liberal, coastal cities, right? That's an utter failure to communicate. And that's a failing on the part of the left, I think. I really do, not to make this too political, but we need to understand where we're coming from. And I think that, the best way to understand where people are coming from is to look at questions of religion and faith and what they believe. Because I really believe that in studying history, that's the best way to understand where people are coming from. You have to understand their beliefs. It's not economics. It's not wars and battles. Those things are important, but those things are a manifestation of something much deeper, which is belief and faith, in my opinion. It's like the reason why people do the things they do is because of their belief systems.
Yeah. And at least that's what their guiding force is.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, money definitely plays a part.
Yeah, but money is just a tool. I mean, you look at some of the richest people in the world, right? What are they doing? Yeah, some of them are just sitting on their wealth, but a lot of really rich people are using their money to try to enact their agendas and their beliefs in the world. I mean, you look at people like Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers in the U.S. Like they're very rich people often become ideological activists and use their wealth to shape the world, not even just in their own image, but often to fulfill deep. They look at what does their faith tell them to do with their money and power. This is one of the reasons why the evangelical narrative has become so potent in America. There's a lot of very rich and wealthy evangelicals just as there are with any religion. And you'll often see people at that level of power and that level of play acting ideologically with their wealth. So money is just, money's an abstraction, right? It's not actually real. It's just an agreement between people, and
Yeah.
and money is concentrated power. Anyways, I could get on a whole tangent with this, but I think you get what I think. I'm going
Yeah.
off into the weeds, but I think you get what I'm saying.
And that is one of the important things in this book is to see that passage from John Dee's time to today and how it's sort of an unbroken line.
It is in the sense of that the ideas are unbroken. I'm not a
Yeah.
conspiracy theorist, and I think that there were like secret societies passing these things back and forth. Although in many cases there were, absolutely. It's just not that you can draw like one. It's not
Right.
like a Assassin's Creed video game or something like that, where it's like there's one order controlling everything. It's really much more about the potency of the ideas and how they spread from brain to brain and influence people. And those, mimetically, it's much more about mimetic influence than direct physical influence. So, like these ideas could be dormant, let's say, for 50 years of history, and then somebody finds the books again, and then they become active, right? It's the same. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure that lots of people reading this book, or will be mimetically infected by it, and who knows what will happen next.
And I highly recommend the book. It's called John Dee and the Empire of Angels. It's out on Inner Traditions. I've been talking with Jason Louv. And where can people find you online?
So the best place to find me is jasonlouv.com, and you'll find everything there. You can find the book, my other books, my social media. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram. You can find podcasts and interviews, and you can find magic.me, my school for magic, where I teach all this stuff, including Enochian Magic. There's a class on Enochian there.
Hmm.
Just uploaded in the last few weeks that people are very excited about. So yeah, jasonlouv.com, and then please follow me on Twitter at Jason.
All right. Thank you very much, Jason, for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great. Thank you for having me on. I'm honored by it, and it was a great interview.
And a big thanks to all of my patrons who are pledging $10 or more: William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Patricia Giaquinta, John Eddy, Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you guys so much for the extra help, but thanks to all my patrons as well, because everything counts, and it really does help keep this show going. I appreciate it a whole lot. Thank you. So since I have a couple minutes here at the end, I wanted to address some stuff from the last show. Yeah, I think it was the last show. It's not the last recorded show. I have another show to put up here in a few days. But the one we did with Rojan and Daniel Harms on the Flat Earth. And of course, I expected some Flat Earth people to be upset that we were, making fun of the Flat Earth. But one of the things that seemed to come up occasionally in comments, and I'll look at this one here as a great example. He says, I believe the Earth is round, but for a show that talks about aliens, Yetis, ghosts, Illuminati, to make fun of a theory like the Flat Earth seems very closed-minded and forced. But, and I can understand that. But here's the difference. First of all, yes, we talk about aliens. I don't know that we've ever talked about the Illuminati. But anyone who listens to this show knows we're talking about the comprehension of these things. We're not out here saying ghosts exist. We're saying people experience ghosts. Let's try and figure out what they are and look at different ideas. And anyone who listens to this show knows I'm not a big proponent of the extraterrestrial theory either. Although I do believe there are aliens out there, I'm not particularly sure they've ever visited Earth. I think the UFO phenomena is something completely different. But still, it's a point. But here's the difference with the Flat Earth Society and let's say ghosts. Okay, the Flat Earth Society is a belief. There's you don't become a flat earther based on evidence because there really isn't any. It is purely and completely a belief. It's a rejection of modern science and modern culture. It's oftentimes a religious belief. And that is not the same as believing somebody when they say they saw a ghost or had a strange encounter. I totally believe that people have these encounters. I may not know if their interpretation is right. And it might be. I don't know is the point. Even the encounters I've had with things, I kind of keep an open mind on what they might have been. But flat Earth stuff is a belief. It is a belief, and it's not an experience. It's not. It's a very different animal, and that's why us kind of making fun of it when they say things like Australia doesn't exist. That's a real pushing. Like, how far do you have to go? So, yeah, it's not the same thing. And like I said, I expected the flat Earth people to be upset with that show because we were kind of laughing at them. But we're laughing at them because it's a ridiculous belief, and it's interesting, like, to look at it as, why has this belief come about? Why do people have this belief? Well, they have this belief either because it's a religious thing, or they have so much distrust in the powers that be, because the powers that be have lied to us so much that they literally reject everything down to the point that the earth is round. It's not really worthy of a debate, I don't think. But looking into that aspect of it, why do people believe this? That is actually kind of interesting. And it's a failure of our culture, really, that people so expect to be lied to about everything that they literally reject everything that is given to them through through science and through stuff that they can't see for themselves, and even stuff they can see for themselves. You can see the curvature of the earth if you go high enough in a plane, and they'll explain it away because it's a belief. It's not it's not factual. It's not arguable in that sense. So I kind of want to take a moment and address that. We generally don't make a habit of making fun of people, but some of the flat Earth stuff is really funny when it comes down to it. Again, great example is Australia doesn't exist. Anyone you've ever met from Australia is an actor. Yes. All right. That one's awesome. Okay. And I guess that's it. We will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.